I want to do a brief introduction. Lots of you all probably know Dee way better than I do, but our brief conversation earlier reaffirmed my belief that the Presbyterian Church, unlike 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon, there's no more than 2 degrees from any one Presbyterian to another. Which, I mean, that's a good thing and a bad thing. We're a small church, but we're connected to lots of the same folks. And so, looking over Dee's bio is really interesting because she's done a lot of different things. She's in addition to being an ordained pastor, she's also a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's currently serving as the interim executive presbyter for the Heartland Presbytery. And she's been in a number of different congregations and some other presbyteries as well. She does some work with the United States Air Force, I notice, which is interesting to me. But the thing I found really interesting is the work that she does with her business, Adventures for the Wild at Heart. And some of you may know some about that already, but I think that relates to the lion that you can see in the background there. But if you read her bio that we sent out, it sounds like just a really wonderful, playful kind of business to have. And it tells me a lot. Let me say this, it creates a lot of expectations for me about what Dee brings to the table. And I'm sure that she will meet or exceed all of those. So Dee, we're so happy to have you with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dee.
Rejuvenation. I like that. Thank you, Dana. I appreciate it. And hi to friends who are very old friends that I've known for a long time, and to new faces. It's a joy to be with y'all. I love to, in fact, a church that both Jason and I served had a regular way of opening worship. And I've integrated that to many of the Zoom calls of moving from getting here to actually arriving here. And I mean that by landing in our bodies and being fully present. And so I would ask you to take a moment and to just check in with yourself. Just notice how you're feeling. Maybe there's tension someplace in your body. Maybe you're tired. And as you notice, maybe you're holding your breath. But as you start to notice what's happening inside, think of a sound that might match how you're feeling. And I'm going to invite you to do something real risky and actually unmute yourself. And at the count of three, we're all going to kind of sound out what we're experiencing. Now, the good news is we're all going to do it together. So nobody's going to be, ostracized. That if they are having an out of control day, that's great. And we'll all be together in this. But just take a moment. And at the count of three, please unmute yourself. And we will all share in our sounds. Okay? Are y'all ready? 1, 2, 3. Woo!
Relief.
So you'll find, and throughout the time today, what I'll do is I'll do a little content. I'll come off some of the PowerPoint presentations to ask questions. Without knowing this group very well, I know y'all are experts in many of these fields. And so some of this may just be old cake to you. And it's like, keep going. We want something else. And so I'll be using that as a gauge to try to understand what we can get to that's going to be of great service, hopefully, to you. I am going to, whoops, I did that too soon. I forgot to share my screen. So let me come back, share my screen. And go here, and we'll hit play. So I want to say just hello, and I'm so glad to be here. I often lead with appreciation, and just two people that I do a nod to regularly is Dr. Katie Hendricks. Katie and Gay, her husband, were two psychologists from Colorado who founded the Hendricks Institute. She was a psychologist who specialized in kinesiology. So therefore, you'll see a lot of the movement integration. He was one who specialized in breath. And so the other component of a lot of the work they do. I started studying with them a few years ago. It's almost been 10 now. And I have to say I was their biggest skeptic. I thought many of the tools they utilized were too simple. But what they did was they melded down many different approaches into some very basic offerings that were easy for people to get to the core of what's happening. So I can say reliably, I've used their tools and I found them to be very helpful. The other is the group I work with and I'm a faculty member with is the Restoring Resourcefulness group. This group, Restoring Resourcefulness is a different name for resiliency, but it's a lot of what I think all of us are involved with in today's society and around us. A couple of things just about me is I tend to approach this as I'm assuming all of you do, but I'd rather not begin with assumptions, is I see us all as whole human beings. So when we're God-given created, I know that indeed we as Presbyterians tend to accentuate our mental intellect as the only intelligence. And I want to say I believe in body intelligence, I believe in emotional intelligence, and spiritual intelligence. I believe it's the whole that actually informs us and shapes us. I also believe that our emotions are gifts of God. And so I don't have a value on good or bad or right or wrong. They just are part of us as much as my arm is a part of me and my foot is a part of me. I am also very clear. In fact, even as an interim executive presbyter, I'm not a fix-it person. My very first presbytery meeting, I brought in a giant wrench. And I said, if this is what you're expecting of me, I'm not going to be the person that you want for this position. I really believe we're all whole human beings. And so I believe the struggle in itself is helpful. And I'm not one who will jump in to help relieve somebody who's having uncomfortable feelings, because I believe that's part of the growth process. And I think it's vital that we operate from some of those places to be able to encourage each other as we walk in this journey. I also want to say the work I do is the great both and this is what I love about it on so many levels. The tools I use and the things that you'll hear today, I've used this many times just for myself. And that's what I've loved about the military. If you knew about me, I really am I'm very much a pacifist. I had no background in the military. And here I was facilitating with many military bases. So it started off in the Air Force, but we've done Army, we've done around, I've done the national keynote for our military chaplains. It seems like an oxymoron for me. I walk in, I know nothing about the context in which they serve. And I laugh because I'm teaching folks who have a very systemic piece of how they do things about diaphragmatic breathing, about movement, about expressing their emotions. But the powerfulness in this is these are the people who support the personnel in the military. Many of them have found not only are these tools helpful for them to use with their clients or the people they coach or the people they provide pastoral care to, they also have found them to be helpful for themselves. So it's a both and. They can use them, but they can also share them. I did go back and watch last month's session with Dr. Lori Ferguson, and she talked about trauma, and I've listed off her pieces that she covered so wonderfully. I added in another section as vicarious or secondary trauma, because that's another component of this that I think we are faced with as a, quite honestly, as a nation, but as a world that we're looking into. And so it's just an awareness of the level of trauma that is existing in our world. I also asked, and this was part of the presentation that I did with the Presbyterian Outlook. I asked our personnel committee, and this is pastors and leaders, how they were feeling. Now, this was this was last fall. And I asked them how they were feeling these days, because knowing at that point, many of them were pretty tired and they were approaching Advent and it was pretty exhausting. And they put together this video that I just love to share because they're great leaders, but they were willing to play with me. So let me.
Running on empty, running blind, running into the sun, but I'm running behind.
So they were willing to play, even if they don't sing on key or anything like that. But they represent, I believe, what's happening with many of the people that we coach around the country, even more so today. Many have white knuckled it and even tried to just hang on to Easter. If we can make it to Easter, we're going to make it through. And the reality is we are facing a tsunami. And that's true of emotional burnout, of trauma and some PTSD. There's a dual pandemic going on between racism and between the pandemic that's affecting not just our country, but many countries. And I believe the demands that are on the parish and within our denomination are very high. I know I have talked to many pastors around the country who are all evaluating if they're going to stay in parish ministry or not. They did a great job of pivoting. It's been exciting. They could do it. They've been able to manage through major high holy days, and they're to the end of really doing this now that it's going back to either a hybrid worship or trying to make all the pieces work to go back to in-person worship. And they're exhausted. And so I think these are things that are facing a lot of our pastors and other people we work with. I watched on Drew Barrymore, I think it was 2 days ago. I don't ever watch TV in the afternoon, and for whatever reason, I think I was doing something in preparation for packing, but Brene Brown was on, and Brene Brown made a statement, and she said, we are facing a mental health crisis in our country, because so much of us and so many of us have been just hanging on to get back to what is normal. And the reality is, we're not going to go back to what is normal. And so people have been kind of finding ways to distract, finding ways to get through. But the level of loss, the level of grief, the level of trauma and fear that has been evoked for so many people through this time, it's going to come to the surface for us to address. And she has this quote, which I really appreciate. She said, you have to turn toward the suffering and the pain. And initially it feels very hard to do that, but it's only when you turn toward it, that's what alleviates the suffering, not ignoring it or acting like it doesn't exist. And I concur with that. It's our natural propensity to run away from anything that feels pain. Even when we're getting a vaccination shot, we pull our arm in. We kind of, oh, I don't want to feel the pain. But the reality is that is what moves us through to the other side. That is what moves us through. So if we jump, and as Presbyterians, we know if we jump to Easter without going through Good Friday, it really impacts Easter. There's a piece there of why we look at the whole process. A couple of other just content pieces are burnout. Burnout is a high piece that's facing many of our pastors and the work they're doing, and also those we coach. I love this quote from Freudenberger. It's from 1975. I was in junior high at the time. So that to me, it's kind of profound that I can look back and say, wow, this still speaks to, I would say, many people today, in which he talked about the three components were emotional exhaustion, we're carrying too much for too long, depersonalization, where we're depleting our care, our empathy, our compassion. Many might say all the numbers we see regularly of those who have died is a depersonalization. And then the desensitization of accomplishment, that futility, that what we're doing isn't enough. It doesn't make a difference. That these three things combined really add to burnout. And some of you may be experiencing that yourself as a coach. As the work you do, you may be feeling like there's just too much need, and where is this going to come from to be able to support? Another great book, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit, is by Emily Nagasaki and Amelia, and it's called Burnout. And again, it's that holding it together, holding everything together till we get to when everything's safe again. So with all that, I would invite you to, and I'm going to stop the share. This is a little bit of a challenge here, just to get my, I'm going to come back to y'all. And I invite you to take just a big exhale. And then I invite you to take an inhale, but as you take the inhale, try not to inflate your upper lungs. Try to inflate your belly first. If you're a singer, you know this is diaphragmatic breathing, or if you're a meditator, it's letting your belly inflate first and almost letting that be where all the oxygen goes. And you can put your hand on your chest if that helps to know I'm not inhaling through my upper lungs, but I'm actually inhaling through my belly. So I'm letting my belly hand expand first and then exhale. There's all kinds of theory around breath, and we're going to talk a little bit. I want to check in with y'all about that. But sometimes breath is the biggest thing that can bring us back to ourselves, back to this present moment, and check in with how am I feeling and what's happening with me. In all my workshops, I share this, and I don't know if it's because I just like to tell this story, or people do give me feedback. It's a helpful metaphor, so it's not just all self-serving. I grew up in Texas, and in Texas, I was taught how to serve iced tea. So in Texas, iced tea is not served in these little tiny glasses. It's served in these monster, I'm trying to get glasses that are very large. And as a young girl, my mother actually spent time teaching me how to serve iced tea. You see, it's not just about the pitcher and making sure that you have enough and that you're not filling or overflowing your glass. There's a piece of watching the pitcher very closely, because there's a point when the pitcher gets so depleted that there's not enough in the pitcher to fill the entire glass. And it's actually considered rude to pour half a glass into somebody's glass. You want to go back to the kitchen and refill, because otherwise what you're giving them is the dregs that are at the bottom, and people know it. And I believe this is a great illustration for us as care providers, as coaches, as people who reach out, is to always be paying attention to what our pitcher looks like. Are we giving from a fullness, or are we giving from a half pitcher, or even just the dregs? As much as we want to tell ourselves that, oh, I pulled that off, I was exhausted, but they didn't know it. The reality is people do know it. They can tell. They can tell when we're not there fully, when we're not fully ourselves, when we're depleted. And so it's vital that we really take care of ourselves in that manner. So I'm going to go back to, we'll hit play. That self-care is a divine responsibility. I believe that. I spend a lot of time with our pastors talking about this. I never believed that ministry was this idea of we sacrifice ourselves for ministry on the table, the communion table. Too many times we have bought into that mentality, and we reward it. We give kudos for it, for who can become the most exhausted, the most depleted, who has the highest workload. And that is not in any shape, manner, form biblical. And so it's vital that we understand for ourselves and for those we serve that self-care is a divine responsibility. It's also aware that I can take care of others better because I take care of myself. And again, it's the piece of what we call is the loop of awareness. And it's recognizing of how indeed I'm noticing when I'm sitting in a session, if it's on Zoom or if it's in the room itself, I'm doing what I call a loop of awareness. I'm checking in with you and what's happening energetically, what's happening with body signals and flags and everything that's going on. And then I come back to me and I check in with me. What's happening? Wow, I notice I'm hungry. Wow, I notice I'm tired. Oh, I notice I'm getting stiff in the neck and getting curious, not that anything's wrong, but then I go back to them. And it's from this place of this ongoing loop. It's a Mobius loop, quite honestly, because it moves back and forth. And as you develop it, it's what actually supports, I would say, being fully present with whoever you're working with while you're fully present with yourself. I don't think it ever intended that we just kind of shut ourselves off and put ourselves in a corner when we work with others. So this is a piece, and this might be challenging for some, and I'm always open for feedback. if you envision the largest circle, I got feedback from somebody. They said, Dee, you put an olive up. And I said, I didn't even think about that. It does kind of look like an olive. If you envision the largest circle as your client, or maybe that's the family system you work with, or it may be workplace employees, even if it's a parent and that's their family system. But the red dot is the therapist, the coach, that non-anxious presence that we were all taught about, that very neutral, non-impacted individual, and that can be the leader, the boss, the parent, the unconditional presence in the room. We also use the word the self-differentiated self. And the intention was you're influencing their process even by your presence in the room. And it sounded good. It had great merits, but I believe when we mixed in trauma, what happened was we lost, or we didn't create the capacity of how to, as coaches and as care providers and as therapists, how to actually be present with ourselves while we're in that space. So what that space requires, that model, if we don't have that capacity, because some people have developed it and they do it very well, but leaders, parents, therapists, coach, they don't reflect anything that's within them. I often would laugh, and I used it often as a pastor, of having my therapist face on, that non-shockable, nothing you say is going to impact me, when somebody would stand up and sing one of those hymns that was just painful, because that was the polite thing to do. But it was a learned skill that we had in our trainings. So part of that, though, is we also are squelching our own emotional reaction. There's almost a non-existence. And if we don't come back to them in some manner, shape, or form, they start to reside just within us. It also reflects that we're not necessarily impacting, what they're saying is not impacting us, and vice versa, that we're not impacting them. So there's choices of how to deal with this. And I left off the third, which was the healthiest choice, and several people learned how to do it. But I do find the people I work with that are care providers in a variety of areas find it that they land in one of these two camps. They either disconnect in that they're present, but they have fortress, they have armored up, and they have really made themselves unavailable to that other person so that they don't get impacted, so they don't get overwhelmed with what's happening. The other is a person whose heart's wide open and they get overwhelmed and they indeed burn out. So it was a great piece. And some people have heard me talk about this. I was a Bowenian. So where I studied was with the Family Systems Institute in Massachusetts. And then we had Peter Steinke, who did great work. But both of these models were very male dominated. They were very masculine oriented, in that self-differentiation was seen as a very rigid boundary. And then came along our feminist Bowenians, who really engaged us with more of a permeable boundary. It was a way that we would be present, yes, but we wouldn't be a non-existent presence. We would be fully present as we are within the relationship. So these are some of the pieces I think that we're faced with as providers, but also that we're faced with people who are in our realm. I am going to come back off screen and come back to y'all. Let me get, how do I get, there we are. Am I off sharing screen? No, I'm still in sharing screen. There you are. So I do want to ask, are y'all familiar with diaphragmatic breathing? Are you familiar with belly breath? Because if you are, I won't spend time going through that. The big piece with belly breathing, and this is what's so vital, is with a diaphragmatic breathing, the difference, the contrast as opposed to breathing from your chest. Because most people, if you just notice, again, that loop of awareness, you're noticing what the person is that you're coaching, and if they're breathing or if they're holding their breath. And you can usually tell, you might even start to match it yourself and notice how you feel if you're breathing the same pacing they are or not. If somebody is breathing from the upper part of their chest, they're getting, it's literally the science is a thimble of oxygen. That's how much you get when you breathe from the upper part of your chest. But that's how the majority of people breathe. If you actually do diaphragmatic, you get a pint of oxygen. So what that means is there's that much more oxygen that goes out, that circulates to your brain, to your body, to your cells, and brings you more life and living. If somebody's holding their breath or they're breathing from their chest, it's vital to recognize it really has an impact on them. So we're going to skip over the breathing part because y'all are experts on that, and I don't need to. It took me a while to figure out with to get a video, and there's a great one, and I'm happy to share resources that's from Massachusetts General Hospital that I use a lot with training people, and it's a video for asthma people on how to breathe, but it is a great video, I think, for people to easily see what they can do to learn how to breathe. And it's like 2 minutes, I want to say. So that helps a lot. So let's go back. Let me stop there and let me just check in. Any questions? Have I upset? Have I stirred the pot with anybody? Anything? Milana, yeah.
Can you share somebody to read for the feminist Bohemian theory?
You know, I need to go back and look at some of my old resources. They came out following and almost the same time as Steinke. There weren't a whole lot that were written, but what they were many of them were teaching in response to this idea of self-differentiation, which is great, and a non-anxious presence. But it was a piece of bringing a feminization to it that said we are whole human beings. We do exist in the room with the other person. And it was recognizing with PTSD, what happens lots of times is people will categorize themselves into, they'll fraction off themselves into certain areas. And so it was a piece of recognizing, wow, we're actually asking our care providers to do a similar thing instead of really creating for them an opportunity that they can have the full experience of being their whole self in the room with them. So I will look for that and I will get that back to you. Yeah. Any others? Okay. So the next piece of this, and I apologize that I'm a little slow on these transitions. There we go. Share my screen. The next piece of this that I have found that's helpful to people is definitely to express yourself. It is vital for emotions. I'm sorry, I'm seeing a weird. Okay, I'm just gonna play. Can y'all see the screen? Because I have all of y'all in the middle of my screen, so I can't see. Can y'all see?
Yeah, we can see it says express yourself. Yeah.
Okay, great. So it's a piece of, in all trauma work, in all burnout work, when people say they feel overwhelmed, that to me is a key indication of they're not expressing. They've taken in a lot of experience, and so they're filling up, but they haven't expressed, they haven't released. And I believe expressing emotions is key, and it's a pathway towards health. It is a fuel source. I appreciate Katie always talks about her belief is that all of our emotions come out of the same hose. So whether it's anger, fear, sadness, glad, whatever that is, even our spiritual creative energy all comes out of the same hose, and it's a fire hose. So if people will say, I can feel everything but anger, she talks about that kinks their hose. So if they're resisting feeling anger, what it does is that cuts them off from fully feeling their other emotions. And so it cuts them off from feeling fully the rest of their whole selves. And so it's why it's important that that they do feel, that they do express without a judgment attached to that. It also doesn't dissipate. If we say we block our emotions or we're not feeling it, what we know, and this is all physiologically proven, it shows up in our bodies. There are reasons people get sick. There are reasons people develop certain symptoms, and it's not to blame them, but it's an awareness of this is how we're wonderfully made. Our bodies start to absorb those emotions that we don't express. The other piece with emotions literally last. If you have been someone who's been open and fluid, they literally last around 90 to 120 seconds. It really is a movement. It's like a wave. It goes through. And if you're able to sit with it to go the whole way through, it's gone. many times what happens is we start to feel an emotion. And I say myself in this as well. I start to feel an emotion. I think, why am I sad? I shouldn't be sad. I don't have anything to be sad about. And instead of just allowing that emotion to be expressed, we short circuit the value of the emotion. And I would say that from expressing the emotion, after we express comes the experience. But the reality is we are known as the frozen chosen. We tend to be people who like to sit quietly and in orderly. And so it's a piece of recognizing, indeed, emotions serve a deep purpose. They serve part of that intellect, but they also serve as part of our fuel source whenever we're looking at trauma and burnout and some of the overwhelm that we're facing. The sisters I spoke about earlier, they actually talk about their approach and their theory to burnout is they really believe that emotions are like a tunnel, and we start going through the tunnel and we get part of the way through and it's either too uncomfortable or we try to analyze them and we get stuck. And by doing that, we actually exacerbate the longevity of the trauma recovery, as well as just moving through what is the wisdom that's coming from that emotion. So that actually exacerbates, if it's grief and it's overwhelming sadness or loss, we see when somebody comes in to see us and they, the family members surround them and say they need to get over their grief. They've been grieving the loss of the loved one for 2 years, but when you sit with them, they really haven't. They have been putting it out in front of them and not actually expressing the grief that they needed to move through. So there's 5, and I tend to go simple. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago, and I think it was almost 80 different emotions that can be defined. And that was fascinating. I read it. I believe that. But when I work with people, I really stick with 5 basic emotions. And the reason why, it's a shortcut. If somebody tells me they're sad or they're angry, I know what they're expressing. If they tell me they're melancholy or they're ambivalent, or, we spend a lot of time then trying to navigate what emotion is really coming to the surface. And it can be a combination of emotions. But to me, it really helps get very specifically clear about what emotion they're feeling. So I tend to go with sadness, anger, joy, sexual or creative energy, and then fear. And I'm going to stop the share with this one. And I'm going to share a handout I use, and I'm happy to share this with y'all, that I find to be very helpful. I actually hand this out to clients and ask them to use that when they're talking with me. So let me move over to this one. And it's emotional literacy piece. So what I do is I hand this out. You can see there's male and female. They're very, I would say, neutral in some of the descriptors, but I will hand it out to them. And what I really review with them is looking at the emotions. So if we look at sadness, when we talk about emotions will reside in our body. If somebody, they may not be outwardly crying, but they may describe a heaviness on their chest. They may describe their throat feels constricted. They may describe a weight on their cheekbones. I see this a lot. That's an indication. It's not a guarantee, but it's an indicator they may be feeling sadness and just are not recognizing it. If they're feeling heat or tension in their neck or along their shoulders or heat down their back, or another very reliable is if they're feeling tension in their jaw. I notice this. All of a sudden I think, wow, I notice my jaw is really, really tight. And my question is, it's from a place of curiosity. I wonder what I'm not expressing that I'm angry about. If it's joy is kind of effervescence everywhere. If it's fear is almost always reliably the belly. So if it's a belly flop, if it's nausea, if it's something like that happening, I notice it's fear attaches going through that. And it could be also, if it's sexual or creative, it's the erogenous zones, because that is the idea of birthing, of creating something new. For some people who haven't expressed emotions for a long time, by looking at something like this as a visual, they may be able to go to just a sensation, just to check in and notice, I notice I'm feeling a tinge on the side of my neck here. And again, from a curious place, I wonder if you just kind of give some loving attention to that tinge, just being with it. And it's a way to kind of help people open up to seeing what they're experiencing and to hopefully open up that flow of emotions. Uh, Again, a lot of people have shut down for a long time, and so they don't know. So I find this tool to be very helpful, just to start paying attention, because they don't think necessarily to go to their bodies. They many times will try to analyze what's going on. And this is a piece that I feel is helpful, is after they go to that place. um, I should do this a lot better. I apologize. After they go to that place of what they're experiencing and expressing it, then those questions can be asked. Then the questions can be asked of how is it that what I'm feeling is, if I'm sad, what's wanting to be let go of? If I'm angry, what no longer is serving me? What's wanting to be ended or changed or stopped? If I'm joyful, what's wanting to be celebrated that I haven't given my attention to? If it's sexual or creative, what's wanting to be born? What's wanting to be creative? And then the fear, what is wanting to become known? These to me are vital, because they really provide that opportunity to explore with them beyond just what their minds might tell them. And because a lot of times what's happening within their academic, their mental intelligence, is they have to have a reason to feel what they're feeling. And what this tool actually does is invite them, you can feel anything at any time for any reason, and to be curious about it and loving about it and almost welcome it as a gift, as opposed to having to justify I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Pema Chodron, I love, talks about, she talks about personas in this way, and I also feel this way with emotions. She said when those parts of ourselves that we're not really comfortable with or we have a judgment about show up, our response should be to see them as a very young baby or a young Buddha that's really looking at us saying, what is it you need right now, and how can I provide that for you? So it really provides that loving experience for expression. The other piece to recognize is, we know this. If we're uncomfortable with certain emotions, we will only then be able to go with others in their expression of those emotions as far as we're comfortable. I'm not necessarily, I'm not inviting, and I believe people have to be very specifically trained to go back and to stir up old emotions. This is truly being in the moment with people as emotions show up in that time. And so that's something I want to just be clear about is, I'm not sure to try to go back with somebody and try to get them to spur on those emotions. If you're not trained in that area, I think it can be somewhat dangerous, because you can re-traumatize people. But it's being in that, all of a sudden somebody is feeling very angry. So how to be with them in their anger, and to recognize what is it that they're wanting to let go of, and to explore that. One of the other pieces of this is fear, and fear and its impact on our nervous system. And so I want to show this quick video, and it just kind of shows what it does to your body physiologically, because this is a piece that I think we don't realize. And to think about this in context of, we have spent the last year plus in a lot of fear. So I hope this helps.
Your heart and thoughts race. Your palms sweat. Your stomach churns. You're afraid. This is your body on fear. Fear evolved in humans to protect us. When you're scared, your brain sets off an elaborate and coordinated response, even if there's no threat. These physical changes, from deep inside your brain all the way to the muscles in your legs, happen in seconds. That's because of your sympathetic nervous system, or your fight or flight response. It's part of your autonomic nervous system, which manages reflexes like breathing, digestion, and your heartbeat. Fear kicks your fight or flight response into overdrive. Your adrenal glands secrete adrenaline. Blood flow decreases to your brain's frontal lobe, which is responsible for logical thinking and planning. Your amygdala, a more animalistic part of your brain, takes over. Your heart rate and blood pressure increase. You breathe faster and your muscles tense up. Your pupils dilate so you can see the threat more clearly. Blood flows away from your extremities, making your hands cold and clammy and making you feel flushed and sweaty. Your digestion slows down. Your body doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. That's why your fight or flight response kicks in during things like public speaking or being in a crowd. To your fear response, you're always running from a predator in the woods. It's just trying to keep you alive.
So it lets you know kind of what happens to your body or anybody's body when they're afraid. The research has actually expanded beyond the 2 responses to fear. They actually say that there's 4. There's fight, there's flee, there's freeze, and there's faint. And that adrenaline happening in your body and happening for a longer period, because if it's more than 10 minutes, it starts to impact your entire body and how you respond. I saw an ad on television today from, it was in Kansas City, but it was from the health agencies saying, if you're having issues and palpitations, please come to the hospital, because so many people are showing more heart issues, but they're afraid to go to the hospital. And some of this they're recognizing is also being generated by a lot of fear that's been cycling and recycling, and the adrenaline has ramped itself up. I'm not going to show it today, but I will send this in a link. And Dana, if it's okay with you, I'll send this if y'all can send this out. This is a dear friend of mine. She's part of the faculty. This is Vandana Verma, Dr. Vandana Verma. She's a NASA scientist. So she actually has sent mice and many people up to the space stations. But she talks, and she's written a great article about what adrenaline does to your body on a long-term basis and why it's really impacting us as a nation, and particularly during these pandemics, and what we need to do differently. So we've talked about breath, expressing emotions, loop of awareness, and I know we're getting close, so I'm gonna do real quick on movement. Another easy key tool is whenever anyone is experiencing trauma is to get them up and moving in their bodies. It can be as easy as gentle movements, but as long as they are not in a sedentary space, to actually get themselves moving in an easy and way that their bodies want to move. I'm a big fan of Peter Levine. If you haven't read Waking the Tiger, to me, it's an essential of dealing with trauma. His philosophy, his approach, he's a professor at DU and at CU. And his approach and his philosophy was he worked both within psychology and in behavior. And he studied animals in that moment that the predator is chasing them. They go through a natural reaction to shock in which they freeze. After living in Colorado and up in Evergreen, what I would hear often is the mountain lions would find somebody's pet and drag it off. And then all of a sudden the dog or the cat would return back to the home. And what happened was the predator would take the animal off, not consume it there, but indeed would leave it to come back later when they could actually go ahead and kill the animal. The animal would come out of that shock place, and the very first response that they would do is they would shake, they would move. It's similar to a bird who hits a window in your home when it stuns them, and the first thing they do is shake and move. Peter Levine believes this is one of our biggest nuances to PTSD these days, is to recognize we often go to analyzing, to talking about, to trying to figure out and make sense of, when indeed our bodies need to express. We need to express emotions, but we need to express in movement what our bodies want to do. And so he is a big piece that I would encourage, if you haven't read any of his work, it's very exceptionally done. He actually personally realized this himself when he was hit by a car and what his body wanted to do. The last piece is when I talk to people about trauma, or when they describe, that level of PTSD, they often describe it as a solid shot put, something that's so dense in their body that it's almost impossible to ever break apart, to ever make sense of, to ever digest, if we want to use the exact words. And so the last piece to me is play. And when I talk about play, I'm not talking about being silly or being, frivolous. It truly is the work of Stuart Brown in his discovery around play and how it shapes the mind and invigorates the soul. It's the idea of play actually starts to open up these places, so that the image on the right, which is opening up the places that are so dense, it breaks open holes so that love can get in and healing can make a difference. His qualities of play are these: they're purposeless. So if somebody says, I play all the time, I go to competitive sports, that's not really play, that's competitive sports. They're voluntary, there's an attraction to it, there's a freedom, you lose track of time, you lose track of awareness of yourself, there's an improv to it, and you want to continue it. And so play becomes a very powerful piece in the work you do. And again, I would offer, I think Peter is, I think Stuart is the leader in the field of this to help with play. A couple of the other pieces is what play does is play integrates all these pieces. Play takes the neurological evolution, because there's now scientific movement that's been proven that if you play with something, you can actually learn it significantly quicker. I think the difference is 4 times to 400 times of repetition. It improves health. It improves your movement. It diffuses adrenaline, which goes back to why indeed we need to get adrenaline out of our system. And it sparks creativity. And creativity addresses then the futility of what I'm doing doesn't matter. So I'm going to push pause and see. I know I've done a lot of talking. I went longer than I thought, but I want to check in. Our questions, confrontations, whatever your thoughts are about this or how this has gone. Are you bored? Nothing new.
Dee, I was thinking about some of those different emotional states that I've been through in the last year, and how they may have, differed a little bit in whether in intensity or in length of time. And I noticed you had the thing about adrenaline and, sort of extended adrenaline periods. And there certainly have been, I've had a lot more Sunday mornings where I've been doing virtual worship, where the adrenaline would kick in because something wasn't working right, in a whole different way than I've ever experienced, except maybe when I was, new in ministry. So that extended use of in addition to the preaching to a camera instead of to faces in a congregation, and that distanced. So I was just kind of reflecting, I guess, on that, and the emotions and the intensity in that regard.
I appreciate that, Dana. I know with adrenaline, for me, I felt it a lot watching the news. And I know if I sat there and just watched it and let this churn in my body, it was going to create a very unhealthy situation. So I have a golden retriever, and I do what I call stomp walks. And I would leave after watching the news and go out and walk and intentionally stomp while I walked. Back in the days when I was a therapist, long ago, there was the idea of breaking dishes was considered somehow, it was a cultural piece, but we knew there was an effect that was helpful for that. And it was the sound of breaking, but also the impact of physicality of working that through. And I think we need that. I think we need ways and options of being able to get out and express through letting that adrenaline diffuse through our systems.
I was really struck by the concept of play that you mentioned, and the playfulness. And being here in Rochester, we have the Strong Museum of Play, which is different toys. Like it's just a huge museum of toys and learning through play. And when I first went, I was kind of like, what is this? This is just kind of silly. But as you go and you spend time there, you just are so much awareness, not just of, how much we learn through play and how quickly. So I really appreciated that part.
Thanks, Mike. And I appreciate you raising that because one of Stuart Brown's pieces, and he was a mentor of mine, and I got to meet with him before I did my sabbatical. One of his premises of his books were based on animals and how animals play. And again, it's we think oftentimes of we have to go back to our childhood. Our childhood can inform us, but the piece is it's an engagement that for him and his research opened up this field where for the longest time he's a Stanford professor for graduate school in psychology, and for the longest time what we thought is the two responses were fight or flight. Those were the only two responses. He introduced the third is play, that in the midst of conflict, if we can invite playfulness, if we can realize, wow, this person is an ally for me. This person is teaching me. I don't like it. I don't like the way they're doing it, but this is learning for me. They become a playmate in my own life. They become somebody who I can kind of learn, okay, how does it work dancing around this? Or if it is a horrifically, traumatic piece, we don't want to minimize what they're experiencing. But we also know there's a piece there that happens in funerals. There's a piece there that happens when everybody laughs because there's an opening to experiencing all the emotions that come with that. And I think sometimes we get real narrowed in on just the one aspect of it. I'm seeing Becky's hand up, and then I see Mitch too.
Becky. Years ago, at some workshop, I heard a person say it's fight or flight as two reactions. But this person, and that was before the freeze theory also was a part of it. This person contended that for women, we befriend. And I found that an interesting comment. Have you heard that? What are your thoughts, Dee?
I haven't. I like that. I will include when I send this resource list out, the four it's a video that's one of those animated videos, but I think it's helpful. It talks about the four things and movements that help people move through the fear, because fear you metabolize very differently in your body than you do anger. And so fear, you really need a different type of movement that comes through that helps move that on through. But I love the idea of befriending it, because again, this idea that we say, do not be afraid, again, that's a tonality we hear in scripture. And yet the reality is that's a tonality that I often challenge. I believe our Creator comes to us like a parent does in the middle of the night and says, oh, you're afraid. Don't be afraid, as opposed to something's wrong with you because you're afraid. And I think that's a piece that we're challenged as coaches to work with people who have that mentality in kind of embedded in their thoughts. Graham and Mitch, I don't know which one of y'all was first.
Well, I want to pick up on the play aspect. And if you put on your mid-council hat and we're thinking of coaching a congregation to go in an opposite direction than fight or flight, as tends to be often the case, what's an example of using play for a congregation? So
that's a great question, Mitch. I would even say with the presbytery, this presbytery was known as Heartless Presbytery when I came. I didn't know that until I was here. They kind of kept that secret. But so my first official, when I was there, I realized people went to the microphone and they were contentious and they just kind of yelled whatever they thought. And so I took a real simple tool and I invited them to say, it's an easy sound, just it feels good in your mouth. I invited them to do it. This is most of my report. And I said, now what does is it shifts you from narrow focus, which is critical, to open focus. It actually physiologically moves you to the other part of your brain. So before you get up to rebuke somebody or to refute them or to argue with them, I invite you to just take a moment and and then move forward. They did it, which surprised me. I thought they're going to look at me like I'm nuts. They did. So we heard humming throughout. And during the other part of my report, somebody challenged me about something, and somebody else said, so are you humming, Dee? And I did. And you know, and it moves me from seeing them as the enemy to seeing a wider perspective to what's happening here and to engage it. So
So I'll say, Thank you. This has been helpful. Just to comment on that, I think if you're at level 4 conflict, if people are still together at level 5, playfulness is hard to introduce. So just kind of a caution kind of in that, because then it becomes another thing folks can, get angry and upset about. So two other things. One is, can you send us the resource of what that cartoon on your body's response to stress, to adrenaline? It was great. I love the dashboard, and actually kind of seeing that in terms of body responses. And also, thanks for the reminder on Bowen theory. Sometimes we make that the be all end all, and I've been trained in Bowen and appreciate it and use it. Nevertheless, the whole, being a non-anxious presence, I think, sometimes Peter Steinke would also say we're not dead.
Right.
We have a self, we have to bring that self into, the context. So thanks for that reminder. But yeah, this is helpful.
And Graham, thank you. I appreciate that. I do want to say, with play, it may even be how you engage with the group. So if people are in the midst of a 4 and all of a sudden I'm going to tell a joke or try to do something, it's not going to be helpful. One thing I did with a congregation who thought they were 400 members, literally when I started to serve them, and come to find out they were 120, and they had not faced into the fact that they were a much smaller congregation. This was a very hard reality. Everything on their budget, their programming, everything reflected 400 members. So I gathered the leadership together, and knowing this is a very painful thing to face, we did an exercise I called FACT, and it's facing, accepting, choosing, and then taking action. But to face it, knowing it's going to evoke a lot of feelings around it. But again, how that's introduced of, let's look at where is that located in the room, and having people stand up and turn away from it, turning toward it, and then starting to play. And I use this word not to be silly, but to say, how have I not looked at that? How have I avoided looking at that? So that little simple invitation shifts everybody out of this defensiveness of it's just something hard to, they started playing. People started looking under their arms, and they started looking underneath, sideways. They started sharing. The way we avoided it was we just kept adding people to the roles, and we never went through and even looked at the roles. And so all of a sudden it starts to diffuse the intensity of it so that we can actually face it and then move forward with it. So it is a both and. It's not coming in being silly, but it is coming in, and how can this be an engagement that involves people in a different way, maybe looking more from a creative way to look at it than just something's wrong and we have to fix it.
What are those for again? Face, the acronym?
FACT, face,
Yeah, right.
accept, or acknowledge. I prefer acknowledge, and then choose, and then take action. And I use those a lot. I've used those a lot with churches and with congregations on when there's something they haven't really spent time addressing, when they've really been avoiding something.
I'm gonna pull the plug here, but this has been fantastic, Dee. Really appreciate it. Mike, you want to go ahead, and I know you've already posted some stuff for those who had to hop off earlier, but you want to go ahead and give the closing word information here?
Sure. So please remember to email the opening and closing words to the Presbyterian Coach Network at gmail.com. And the closing words today is play. That'll be our closing word. And a reminder that in 2 weeks, our coaching conversation network or supporting will be April 22nd at 4 o'clock. And then our next learning call is May 13th with Paul Burns doing the GPS inventory. So that is the announcement. Dee, thank you so much for sharing with us today and spending your afternoon with us.
Happy to. And I'll send all the different things I've talked about. I'll send a link to them to Dana.
Yeah, send them to me. And I'm going to actually, the easiest thing, folks, is if you actually will sign on any files, for example, we can't send files out through our MailChimp account. But what I can do is I can post them on our new Mighty Networks. So you got an email about that. And I'll send that out again with it. I mean, I can send links easily enough, but files, there's no easy way to do that. But I can post those in our Mighty Networks page. And you can access them there. So Dee will send them to me and I'll get them up there.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.